Picture this: the year is 980 AD. A Viking army, hardened by raids and conquests, arrives at a site chosen by their leader. Within weeks, an enormous fortress rises from the earth, perfectly circular, geometrically precise, and so well constructed that modern engineers still scratch their heads trying to figure out how it was done without modern tools. These were the Viking ring forts, massive circular strongholds scattered across Denmark and southern Scandinavia. Built with military precision, they weren't just defenses. They were statements of power, authority, and technological dominance. But here's the shocking part: no one knows exactly how the Vikings designed them. The geometry is flawless, the organization breathtaking, and the speed of construction almost unbelievable. Hollywood never shows this side of the Vikings, not just as raiders with axes, but as engineers who could build fortresses that remain a mystery to this day. Part 1. The birth of the ring forts. The Viking Age is often remembered for chaos raids, plunder, and fire. But in the late 10th century, a new kind of order appeared. Around the reign of King Harald Bluetooth, great circular forts began to rise across Denmark. Known as Trelleborg-type ring forts, they shared a strikingly uniform design. A perfect circle with ramparts enclosing 4 massive gates aligned to the cardinal directions. Archaeologists believe these forts were not random experiments. They were part of a carefully coordinated royal program. Harald Bluetooth, eager to consolidate his rule and Christianize his kingdom, needed symbols of control. And what better way to display power than to reshape the land itself into geometry so perfect it rivaled the Roman legions? Each fort was more than just earth and timber. They were centers of administration, barracks for soldiers, and rallying points for war. In a world where most settlements sprawled chaotically, these ring forts screamed discipline, unity, and technological superiority. And the most baffling part? The Vikings had no written blueprints, no advanced surveying equipment, and no Roman concrete. Yet somehow they created fortresses that still leave modern builders stunned. Part 2. Geometry. So precise it defies explanation. At first glance, a Viking ring fort looks like a giant earthwork, a circular wall with wooden gates and houses within. But once archaeologists began to study them closely, they realized something extraordinary. The design was not just functional, it was mathematical perfection. Take Trelleborg, the most famous ring fort in Denmark. Its diameter measures exactly 137 meters, not 136, not 138, but precise down to centimeters. The walls form a flawless circle with 4 gates aligned to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. From each gate, straight timber-paved roads run across the fort, meeting perfectly in the center. This creates a cross that divides the circle into 4 equal quadrants. Inside each quadrant, the Vikings built longhouses placed in parallel rows, all identical in size and angle. It's as if someone had laid out the plan with a compass and ruler tools the Vikings didn't officially have. How did they do it? Some archaeologists suggest they used knotted ropes, laying them out to create right angles and circles. Others argue they may have borrowed surveying techniques from the Carolingians or even from contacts with the Byzantine Empire. But there's a problem: there's no direct evidence the Vikings possessed advanced surveying knowledge. And yet, the forts prove they clearly did. Even more baffling is the consistency across different sites. Trelleborg, Aggersborg, Fyrkat, and Nonnebakken. Each fort is nearly identical in layout, with the same geometry, the same gate placement, and the same orientation to the compass points. It's not as if different builders improvised their own versions. These forts were centrally planned, like a military blueprint executed across an entire kingdom. To put it in perspective, building a perfect circle of that size today, without lasers or GPS, would still be a challenge. For the Vikings to achieve it in the 10th century using only wood, ropes, and muscle is nothing short of mind-blowing. And this leads to a bigger mystery. Were these forts designed for pure military defense, or were they symbols of something greater? A demonstration of royal power, order, and even divine authority. Part 3. Military machines of earth and timber. To understand why Viking ring forts were so feared, we need to look beyond their geometry and focus on their brutal functionality as military bases. These weren't just pretty circles on the landscape, they were war machines built of earth and wood. First, the walls themselves. Each fort was surrounded by a massive rampart made of earth, reinforced with heavy wooden planks and turf. At Trelleborg, the rampart was about 5 meters high, 16 feet, and up to 17 meters thick at the base. That's thicker than many medieval castle walls of stone. From a distance, these ramparts would have looked like a towering ring of earth, impossible to scale without ladders or siege towers. And remember, in the 10th century, most of the Vikings' enemies didn't even have siege technology. On top of the ramparts, the Vikings likely built wooden palisades, creating a spiked wall bristling with sharpened logs. Defenders standing on the ramparts had the perfect height advantage to rain arrows, spears, or stones on any approaching enemy. Then there were the gate's 4 entrances aligned with the compass points. But don't be fooled, these weren't weak spots. They were heavily fortified choke points. Archaeological evidence shows the gates had massive timber structures, possibly even towers. An attacking force charging through one would be funneled into a narrow corridor, exposed to attacks from above and unable to spread out. Inside, the fort's layout wasn't just neat, it was tactical. The cross-shaped roads allowed defenders to move quickly from one quadrant to another. Longhouses doubled as barracks, meaning hundreds of warriors could be quartered inside at any given time. If an enemy managed to breach the outer defenses, which was already unlikely, they would then have to fight house to house against hardened Viking fighters. The largest fort, Aggersborg, could house up to 5,000 warriors. Imagine that, a small city of professional fighters, all armed, trained, and ready to pour out of the gates at a moment's notice. From inside a ring fort, a Viking jarl or king could launch lightning raids in every direction, while his enemies would be forced to waste time and manpower just trying to get through the walls. And these forts weren't just defensive, they were offensive staging grounds. From a ring fort, an army could rest, resupply, and then march out in organized columns. It's no wonder that some historians compare them to Roman military camps, rigid, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. For Viking enemies, facing one of these structures must have been a nightmare. You couldn't burn it, you couldn't easily dig under it, and you couldn't starve it out because inside, the Vikings had storehouses, livestock pens, and supplies. An assault meant heavy losses, while the defenders laughed from above. In short, these weren't just forts, they were statements. You cannot touch us. You cannot outlast us. You cannot outfight us. Tons. Part 4, The Mystery of Their Origins. If there's one thing that makes Viking ring forts so tantalizing, it's this. Nobody knows exactly who built them or why they were all constructed in such a short span of time. Archaeologists agree that most of the major ring forts, Trelleborg, Fyrkat, Aggersborg, and Nonnebakken, were built in the late 10th century, around the reign of King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. Yes, the same Harald Bluetooth whose name inspired the wireless technology in your phone. But what historians can't agree on is this. Were these fortresses the king's grand project to consolidate power, or were they local strongmen's private strongholds? The timing suggests Harald Bluetooth. His reign was one of massive transformation. He famously converted Denmark to Christianity, unified scattered tribes, and fought wars against both Norwegians and Germans. To pull off such sweeping changes, he would have needed a network of secure, loyal military bases across his realm. The ring forts fit that theory perfectly. But there's a twist. All of the forts follow almost identical blueprints, precise circles, quadrants, and gates aligned to the compass points. This isn't the kind of design you get from local warlords improvising. It looks like centralized planning, almost as if one royal architect or one elite team of builders traveled across Denmark and beyond, constructing these near-identical strongholds on royal orders. And here's where it gets even more mysterious. The forts were built quickly and abandoned just as quickly. Many seem to have been in use for only 10 to 20 years before falling silent. Why spend so much labor and resources to raise colossal fortresses only to leave them empty within a generation? Some scholars argue they were built for a single campaign, perhaps Harald Bluetooth's wars against the German Emperor Otto II, or against rebellious nobles inside Denmark. Others believe they were part of a grand strategy to control trade routes and enforce taxation. A jarl or king sitting in a ring fort could monitor passing merchants, collect tolls, and secure his authority. Yet the sudden abandonment suggests something catastrophic. Maybe Harald Bluetooth's fall from power, he was eventually overthrown by his own son, Sweyn Forkbeard, rendered the forts useless. New rulers may have seen them as symbols of the old regime and simply walked away. Or perhaps the forts had served their purpose. They projected power, secured victories, and were no longer needed. Still, even after their abandonment, the forts left a mark. Local people continued to use the sites, sometimes farming the land, sometimes building villages around the ruins. Even in their decay, they shaped the landscape of Denmark for centuries. And here's the kicker. No similar forts were built before, and none after. They appeared suddenly in a burst of construction, then vanished just as suddenly. That makes them one of the most enigmatic legacies of the Viking Age, a riddle carved into the earth. Part 5. Engineering secrets that still stun experts. When archaeologists first uncovered the Viking ring forts in the late 19th and 20th centuries, many assumed they were just crude earthworks. After all, Vikings are usually remembered as raiders, not master builders. But the closer experts studied them, the more they realized these were not primitive forts. They were mathematical masterpieces. Take the geometry. Every fort is almost a perfect circle, not an oval, not a rough ring, but a circle with astonishing precision. At Trelleborg, the diameter is exactly 137 meters across. That's not coincidence. That's mathematics, surveying, and careful planning. Modern engineers who've studied the forts argue that achieving such symmetry without modern instruments would have required advanced knowledge of geometry and practical surveying techniques. How did they do it? One theory is that the builders use ropes, stakes, and measuring cords, laying them out like compasses to draw circles on the ground. But this wasn't simple trial and error. The alignment of gates to the 4 cardinal directions suggests they also had a strong grasp of astronomy, using the sun, stars, and perhaps even shadow boards to orient construction. Then there's the precision of the internal layout. The longhouses weren't scattered randomly, they were positioned with mathematical regularity, lining up perfectly with the roads that divided the fort into quadrants. Every structure had its place, part of a larger design. This level of uniformity hints at centralized command and professional crews, not just villagers piling dirt. Even the materials baffle experts. The ramparts weren't just heaps of soil. They were layered with turf, clay, and timber reinforcements, creating stability that has lasted 1,000 years. Imagine hauling thousands of cubic meters of earth without machines, organizing hundreds of workers, and making sure every piece fit into a master plan. That's not barbarian work. That's military engineering. Some archaeologists even compare the ring forts to Roman camps and fortresses, which were famous for their mathematical order. Could the Vikings have been inspired by Roman techniques passed down through centuries of European contact? Or did they independently develop similar systems? Either way, the result is stunning. And here's the most baffling part. All the forts were built within a short window of time, suggesting that the same design and building expertise spread rapidly. That level of coordination is almost unprecedented in Viking society, which is usually remembered as decentralized and clan-based. These forts suggest something different, a society capable of large-scale state planning. For modern engineers, the ring forts are a paradox. The Vikings are remembered as seafarers and warriors, yet here they display a level of architectural sophistication that rivals the great powers of their age. Even today, with advanced surveying tools, recreating a ring fort with such precision and speed would be a massive challenge. The forts weren't just functional, they were symbolic. They screamed power, order, and control. Anyone who saw one would understand. This was not the work of scattered tribes. This was the work of a kingdom. Part 6. Life inside the Ring of Power. To the outside world, Viking ring forts looked like fortresses of earth and firepower. But step through one of those fortified gates, and you'd find a world buzzing with order, activity, and discipline unlike anywhere else in Viking society. Inside the circular walls, longhouses stood in strict rows, each one belonging to a household, a warrior band, or a support group. These weren't the sprawling farmsteads that most Vikings lived in. They were military barracks, compact, orderly, and communal. Warriors slept side by side on raised wooden benches, their weapons within arm's reach, always ready for alarm bells or war horns to call them to action. The daily rhythm inside the fort was relentless. At dawn, the garrison would rise to the sound of commands, not roosters. Warriors drilled in formation, practicing shield walls and coordinated maneuvers in the open courtyards. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly in their forges, hammering out swords, axes, and nails for fort maintenance. Woodworkers repaired palisades, carts, and longships, ensuring the fort was not just defensible, but ready to launch offensives at a moment's notice. Food was crucial. Within the ring forts, archaeologists have found evidence of storehouses packed with grain, dried fish, and animal bones. Herds of livestock were likely kept in pens just outside the walls, ready to be driven in during a siege. Meals were simple but hearty. Stews of barley and meat, bread baked from coarse flour, and ale brewed in great vats. Everything about the diet was built for endurance, to keep hundreds, sometimes thousands of men battle-ready. But it wasn't just warriors inside. The ring forts were microcosms of society. Alongside the fighters lived women, children, and thralls. Women prepared food, crafted clothing, and tended to daily needs, while children ran messages, carried water, and observed the life of soldiers. Thralls and slave laborers likely did the hardest, dirtiest jobs. hauling timber, maintaining ramparts, or caring for animals. The ring fort was not only a fortress, it was a command hub. Orders were issued from within, messengers sent riding to nearby settlements, and war bands organized for raids or campaigns. When a jarl or king stayed inside, the longhouses doubled as halls of power, where strategies were discussed by firelight and alliances forged over mead. Despite the military discipline, life inside the forts wasn't joyless. Archaeologists have unearthed gaming pieces and personal ornaments, suggesting downtime was filled with board games like Impenetrable, storytelling, and music. Warriors sang songs of past battles, sharpening their courage for the ones to come. But the ever-present sense of danger hung in the air. At any moment, the sound of a horn could mean an approaching enemy. Inside those walls, you didn't just live, you trained, you fought, and you prepared to die. Life in the ring forts was a crucible, turning ordinary men into disciplined warriors, ready to march out in force and crush their enemies. These forts weren't just military bases, they were factories of power churning out soldiers, reinforcing loyalty to kings, and broadcasting the message that the Viking world was shifting from scattered clans into something bigger, something more terrifying, a centralized state with professional warriors at its core. Comms. Part 7. Symbols of Fear and Power. For Viking enemies, the ring forts were not just physical obstacles, they were psychological weapons. Imagine you're a rival chieftain or a foreign invader. You march across the land expecting scattered farmsteads and wooden halls that burn easily. Instead, you come face to face with a perfect circle of ramparts, towering walls, and gates bristling with warriors. It would have been terrifying. The sheer symmetry of the forts itself sent a message. Human beings instinctively associate symmetry and order with power, discipline, and authority. A circular fortress that looked as if it had been stamped into the earth wasn't just a stronghold, it was a symbol of divine or royal legitimacy. To enemies, it must have seemed almost supernatural, as though the fort had been designed by gods or spirits, not men. And then came the reputation. Once word spread of Viking ring forts that they could house thousands of fighters, that they were impossible to burn, and that every gate was a death trap many enemies might have chosen not to attack at all. Sometimes the greatest victory is won without battle. The fort itself projected an aura of invincibility. For locals, the fort sent a different message: submission. If you lived near a ring fort, you didn't need to be conquered, you were already under the shadow of its power. Farmers, merchants, and villages knew that the fort could send out warriors at any time to enforce taxes, collect tribute, or put down rebellion. Its very presence reshaped how people thought about authority. These forts also helped unify Viking identity. No longer were the Norse just scattered raiders or seafarers. The forts proclaimed, "We are a kingdom. We are an organized force. We can defend, control, and dominate land as much as sea." For a society so often defined by mobility, the forts were anchors of power. To enemies abroad, Saxons, Germans, Slavs, the forts were a warning. Do not underestimate us. For rivals within Viking society, rebellious jarls, ambitious warlords, they were an even starker message. The king has the power to build this. You do not. In this way, ring forts weren't just practical defenses. They were psychological fortresses, bending the will of both friend and foe. They combined intimidation, propaganda, and brute force into one seamless package, and centuries later, they still hold that aura. Even today, when archaeologists stand inside the footprint of a fort like Trelleborg, the sense of power is palpable. The circle, the scale, the precision, it feels overwhelming. Imagine how much stronger that feeling was for those who saw the forts in their prime, alive with smoke, fire, and armed warriors at the gates. They weren't just forts, they were symbols of order in a chaotic world and of kingship in a land of tribes. Part 8. The Lasting Legacy of Viking Ring Forts. Though the Viking Age eventually came to an end, the ring forts left behind a legacy that still fascinates historians, engineers, and archaeologists alike. These weren't temporary defenses, cobbled together in times of crisis. They were monuments of authority, deliberately built to last, and their ruins still shape the landscapes of Denmark and beyond. What's most astonishing is how little we fully understand about them. To this day, experts still debate how exactly the Vikings achieved such precision without advanced surveying equipment. Were they using ropes and stakes, carefully measured angles, or even primitive compasses? Did they use astronomical alignments, as some suggest, to orient their gates towards specific stars or the path of the sun? Even more intriguing is the question of why they were built at all. Were they truly meant for defense, Or were they more political than practical grand statements of power designed to intimidate rivals and cement the authority of kings like Harald Bluetooth? After all, few of these forts show evidence of prolonged battles. Perhaps their greatest strength was never tested because their very existence was enough to prevent conflict. Modern engineers admit that replicating the scale and perfection of a Viking ring fort with the same tools would be an extraordinary challenge. Without metal survey equipment, laser levels, or advanced blueprints, how did Viking builders create walls that curved so perfectly into circles hundreds of feet across? That precision alone continues to baffle experts, reinforcing the sense that the Vikings were far more advanced than the barbarian raiders stereotype Hollywood often portrays. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the ring forts lies not in their construction, but in what they represent. The moment the Vikings transformed from raiders into rulers. These forts are evidence of a society learning to organize, centralize power, and dominate not just seas, but land. They were stepping stones from chaos to kingship, from scattered tribes to early states. And yet, even after 1,000 years, when you stand inside the remains of a fort like Fyrkat or Aggersborg, you can still feel their silent message. A circle of earth and timber whispering across time. This is power. This is order. This is control. Circles of power, echoes of eternity. The Viking Age is often remembered for blood and fire, the clash of steel on shields, the burning of monasteries, the roar of longships gliding across storm-tossed seas. But there is another Viking story quieter, more deliberate yet equally powerful. The story written not in raids but in geometry, not in chaos but in order. The story of the Viking ring forts. At first glance, they might seem like simple circles of earth and timber, grassy mounds overgrown with centuries of silence. But when you step back, when you see the perfection of their design, the symmetry, the mathematical precision, you realize you're not looking at ruins. You're looking at statements, declarations of power so bold they didn't need words. These forts were not just defensive strongholds, they were monuments to control. To carve a circle into the land was to say, this is not chaos. This is not the unpredictable world of rival clans and wandering raiders. This is the center, the king's command. A circle that binds people, warriors, and resources into one unified whole. Think about the audacity it took to build them. No blueprints, no computer models, no laser measurements, just the human mind, sharpened by necessity and ambition. The builders had to level ground, move thousands of tons of earth, align gates with perfect symmetry, and create an internal grid that divided space with almost military neatness. Every fort was the size of multiple football fields, yet every angle, every street, every gate fell into harmony. Why circles? Because circles have no weakness. No corners to collapse, no blind spots for enemies to exploit. Circles embody unity, eternity, and perfection. They mirrored the Norse understanding of the cosmos itself, the mythic world encircled by Jormungandr, the great world serpent, or the cycle of life and death that dominated their sagas. To live inside the king's circle was not just to be defended, it was to exist in a symbol. And yet, for all their brilliance, these forts also embody the paradox of Viking history. They were built to last, but many lasted only decades. Why? Because they weren't simply homes or garrisons. They were instruments of politics. Each fort anchored the power of a king, and when that king's grip slipped, so too did the purpose of his fortress. Still, their influence echoed far beyond their walls. The ring forts were a testing ground, an experiment in organized settlement that prefigured the centralized monarchies to come. They paved the way for stone castles, walled cities, and the architectural language of medieval Europe. Archaeologists are still peeling back their mysteries. In the 20th century, when aerial photography revealed just how perfectly circular they were, many refused to believe Vikings had created them without outside help. The idea that so-called barbarians could produce such order was almost unthinkable. And yet, every excavation proves the truth. The Vikings were more than warriors. They were engineers. They were visionaries. They were planners whose imagination went beyond pillage into permanence. And that is perhaps the greatest revelation of all. When we picture the Vikings, we imagine restless wanderers with no ties to land, only to their ships. But the ring forts remind us that they also craved stability, permanence, and mastery of the land itself. Imagine standing inside one of these ring forts 1,000 years ago. The walls rise around you, massive embankments crowned with timber palisades. 4 gates pierce the circle, each guarded and aligned with uncanny precision. Inside, the smell of smoke curls from longhouses arranged in perfect order, soldiers sharpening spears, children running across packed earth streets. the thud of shields as warriors train. Outside, the wild fields of Denmark stretch into the horizon. Inside, there is order. Inside, there is belonging. Inside, there is the king's will. It must have been awe-inspiring. It must have been intimidating. It must have felt like stepping into another world. Today, those walls are gone. The wood has rotted, the people are dust, but the circles remain, carved faintly into the earth like whispers that refuse to fade. You can walk them. You can stand at the center and imagine the hum of life that once pulsed there, and in that moment, the line between past and present collapses. The Vikings are gone. Their ships no longer slice the waves. Their war cries no longer echo in foreign halls. But their genius, the genius that turned raw earth into circles of power, remains. These forts remind us that history is never simple, that the same people who struck terror across Europe also sat down and planned, measured, aligned, and dreamed. That the so-called barbarians could shape geometry as elegantly as they shaped iron. That the Vikings were not just destroyers of worlds, but builders of worlds. And that's why, even today, Viking ring forts continue to baffle, inspire, and haunt us. They are proof that power is not always loud. Sometimes the most terrifying statement you can make is silent. A circle on the land, a symbol no one can ignore. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just think of blood and fire. Think of circles. Circles of earth, circles of power, circles of legacy. Circles that endure long after the hands that built them turn to dust. The Vikings may be gone, but their circles are eternal.